What if the beings that gathered around the ark weren't all human, and Noah saw things no scripture dared to fully describe? The Book of Enoch remembered what Genesis left silent. There is a moment in the story of Noah that most people pass over without realizing what they have just missed. Genesis tells us that Noah entered the ark, that the animals came 2 by 2, that the rains fell and the waters rose. It is a story so familiar that we think we know it completely. But familiarity is not the same as understanding. And there are details that were never included in the version most of us were taught, that change everything about what happened in those final days before the floodwaters swallowed the earth. The Book of Enoch does not replace Genesis. It breathes behind it. It fills the silences that Genesis left open, not out of error, but perhaps out of mercy, because what Enoch describes is almost too heavy for the human heart to carry all at once. And one of the heaviest things it describes is what was happening outside the ark, in the world Noah was leaving behind, in the faces and forms of the beings who watched him build, who watched him load, who watched the door finally close. We have to go back further than Noah to understand what he was seeing. Centuries before the flood, before the rains were even a whisper in the mind of God, something had already gone wrong, not on earth first, but above it. The Book of Enoch, in its opening chapters, describes a group of heavenly beings known as the Watchers. 200 of them, we are told, descended upon Mount Hermon in a deliberate act of rebellion. They took human women as wives. They crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed, and what came from that union was not fully human and not fully divine. It was something the ancient world had no proper category for. The Book of Enoch calls them the Nephilim. Genesis 6 acknowledges them briefly, almost reluctantly. There were giants in the earth in those days, but Enoch gives them weight, gives them history, gives them a devastating portrait of what they became. They consumed everything. They turned against humanity, against animals, against the very ground beneath their feet. They drank blood. They filled the earth with violence so complete, so total, that the cries of the suffering rose all the way to heaven. In 1 Enoch 9, the archangels Michael, Uriel, Sarachael, and Gabriel look down upon the earth and bring that cry before God. They cannot remain silent. The world beneath them has become something unrecognizable. Now hold that image, because here is where Noah's story begins to open up in ways most sermons never reach. By the time God speaks to Noah in Genesis 6:13, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them." The word violence there is not metaphor. It is a report. It is what the angels had already delivered to heaven. The earth had been saturated, corrupted at a level that went beyond human sin. There were creatures walking upon it that should never have existed. And Noah, righteous and unblemished in his generation, as Genesis 6:9 tells us, was surrounded by all of it. The Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees both suggest that in those years leading up to the flood, Noah was not simply a man who kept his faith quietly in a corner while the world fell apart around him. He was a witness. He saw the Nephilim. He knew what the Watchers had done. He lived in the same generation that experienced the full weight of what happens when the boundaries God established between heaven and earth are violated with arrogance and appetite. The giants he saw were not creatures from distant legend. They were his neighbors. They were the reason God wept. And the Book of Giants, fragments of which were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, adds something that stops you cold. It describes the Nephilim themselves having dreams, troubled, terrifying dreams, in the years before the flood. They dreamed of tablets being submerged in water. They dreamed of a great fire. They sent one of their own to the imprisoned watcher Enoch, begging him to interpret what they had seen. Even the giants could feel it coming. Even those born of forbidden union could sense that the world was about to be unmade. And Enoch's answer to them, according to the Book of Giants, brought no comfort. What was coming could not be stopped. What had been written in heaven was already on its way to earth. This is the world Noah carried in his chest as he laid the first beam of the ark. This is what he saw every morning when he stepped outside. Not just human neighbors lost in ordinary sin, but a world where the very structure of creation had been torn open from the inside, where creatures existed that God had never designed, where the violence was not just moral but ontological, a wrongness built into the flesh of what was walking the earth. The Watchers who had caused all of it were already bound by the time the flood came. Enoch 10 describes God commanding the archangel Raphael to bind Azazel, one of the chief watcher rebels, hand and foot, to cast him into the darkness of a desert pit, to cover him with rough and jagged rocks, to hold him there until the day of final judgment. Michael was commanded to bind the others, to imprison them in the valleys of the earth. They would not escape what was coming. But their children, the Nephilim, were still there, still breathing, still consuming, still standing under a sky that was about to break open. So when you read that Noah entered the ark and the Lord shut him in, as Genesis 7:16 tells us, when you feel the weight of that closing door, understand that what was left outside was not just wicked humanity. It was a world populated by beings whose very existence was a wound in creation. And Noah had looked into the faces of all of it. If you have ever felt like you are living through something that no one around you seems to fully grasp, if you have ever stood in the middle of a broken world and wondered how God sees it, then Noah's story is closer to yours than you might think. If this is speaking to something deep in you, subscribe to this channel right now. Every week we go to places in Scripture that most people are never shown, and once you see them, you cannot unsee them. And listen, if you truly want to understand the world that existed before the flood, the beings that walked it, and what the Book of Enoch reveals that most Bible studies never touch, the premium illustrated biblical mystery guide on the forbidden Book of Enoch is the resource you have been looking for without knowing it had a name. It is fully illustrated, carefully researched, and written for people who are done with surface-level faith. It takes you through the watchers, the giants, the rebellion in heaven, and the hidden architecture of a world God chose to wash away. The link is in the pinned comment below. Do not scroll past it. What is waiting for you there is exactly what this hunger inside you has been reaching for. There is something that does not get asked often enough about the flood narrative, and it is a question so simple that its absence is almost suspicious. If the flood was coming to cleanse the earth of corruption, what exactly happened to the Nephilim? Not the Watchers. Their fate is described in detail, bound, imprisoned, cast into darkness, held for judgment. But the giants themselves, the half-breed offspring who had filled the earth with bloodshed, what became of them when the waters rose? Genesis does not answer that question directly. It gives us the flood, the ark, the receding waters, the rainbow. It does not follow the giants to the end. And that silence has sat in the margins of biblical scholarship for centuries, mostly unexamined. But the Book of Enoch does not leave it there. And what it says opens a dimension of the flood story that most people have never been allowed to see. Before we get to their fate, we have to understand what the Nephilim actually were, not just physically, but spiritually. The Book of Enoch is very specific about this. These were beings with two natures fused together in a way that creation was never designed to hold. Their fathers were the Watchers, immortal, spiritual beings who belonged to a realm beyond the material world. Their mothers were human women, mortal, earthbound, limited by flesh and time. The children born from that union were caught between two worlds, too large and too powerful to be fully human, too earthbound, too driven by appetite and rage to carry the dignity of the divine. They were, in the most painful sense, belonging to neither world completely. And that dual nature, that being torn between the spiritual and the physical, is exactly what determines what happens to them when they die. When a human being dies, the body returns to the earth, and the spirit follows the path that God ordained. But the Nephilim were not built that way. They had no ordained path. When their bodies were destroyed by the flood, when the waters finally took them down, their spirits had nowhere to go. No realm had been prepared for them. No destination existed for what they were. The Book of Enoch in chapter 15 records the words God speaks to Enoch about this directly. God tells him that the Watchers were originally spiritual beings who were given eternal life. They were not supposed to take wives. They were not supposed to produce children, but they did. And the giants that came from them, because they were born of both spirit and flesh, when their physical bodies were destroyed, their spirits would not rest. They would wander. They would roam the earth without a body, without a home, without peace, and they would afflict the living. They would cause suffering, They would tempt and torment and press against the boundaries between the spiritual and the physical world for generations to come. Let that land for a moment. What Enoch is describing, what God himself explains in that chapter, is the origin of what the ancient world called evil spirits, what many traditions would later call demons, not fallen angels, not the watchers themselves, who are bound in their prison of stone and darkness, but the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, the children of the watchers, wandering the post-flood world in search of bodies they no longer have. This is one of the most staggering claims in all of ancient Jewish literature, and it connects threads across the entire biblical narrative in ways that modern Christianity has largely forgotten how to see. Think about the gospel accounts: Jesus casting out unclean spirits, the Gerasene demoniac in Mark 5, where the spirits inside the man beg not to be sent out of the region, beg specifically to be allowed to enter the herd of swine. Why would a disembodied spirit beg for a body? Because that is exactly what the Book of Enoch said they would do, wandering, longing, pressing against the living world they can no longer fully inhabit. The ministry of Jesus was not happening in a vacuum. It was happening against a very specific spiritual backdrop, one that the ancient audience who first heard these stories understood in ways that we, centuries removed from that world, have largely lost. Paul seems to know this backdrop too, when he writes in Ephesians 6:12 that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. He is not speaking in vague poetic terms. He is describing a real spiritual geography, a real hierarchy of darkness. And the roots of that hierarchy, according to the tradition Enoch preserves, go all the way back to what happened before the flood. What drowned in those waters did not simply disappear. It changed form. It kept moving. Now here is the part that is rarely discussed. What happened to the Nephilim who died before the flood, killed in the warfare and chaos that their own nature produced? The Book of Enoch suggests that their spirits were already wandering before Noah ever began building. That the spiritual corruption of the world was not only physical, not only the violence and the bloodshed visible to human eyes, but also invisible, also spiritual. There were forces already loose in the world by the time the ark was being constructed that no amount of floodwater could simply wash away. God knew this. The flood was not designed to solve the spiritual problem permanently. It was designed to remove the physical corruption, to destroy the bodies of the Nephilim, to end the reign of terror they had established on the earth's surface, to give humanity a new beginning unpolluted by the presence of these hybrid beings in the flesh. But the spirits, the Enochic tradition is clear that those would remain, that they would have to be dealt with differently, that the final confrontation with what the Watchers had unleashed was not the flood. The flood was only one chapter. The rest of the story stretches forward, through the prophets, through the Gospels, through Revelation, all the way to a final day of judgment that has not yet arrived. Noah understood more of this than we give him credit for. He was not simply a faithful man who built a boat because God told him to. He was a man standing at the intersection of two worlds, one being destroyed, one not yet born, watching the spiritual consequences of heavenly rebellion play out in the faces of the creatures that surrounded him as the waters began to rise. There is a detail buried inside the flood account that most readers pass over in a single breath, never stopping to ask what it actually means. Genesis 7:21 says that all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and livestock and beasts and every swarming creature that swarms on the earth, and every man, every creature. The language is absolute, total, final. But the Book of Enoch and the traditions surrounding it raise a question that verse does not answer on its own. Were all the beings standing outside the ark simply human? Or was Noah watching something far stranger as the waters climbed? The ancient sources that orbit the Genesis account paint a picture of those final hours that is almost impossible to imagine if you have only ever read the sanitized version. The world in those days was not populated by humans alone. We have already established what the Nephilim were, but the corruption that the Watchers introduced did not stop at the production of giant offspring. The Book of Enoch tells us that the Watchers also taught humanity forbidden knowledge, the kind of knowledge that, once released, could not be contained. Azazel taught men to make weapons of war, to work metals into instruments of destruction. Others taught sorcery, astrology twisted into divination, the cutting of roots, the enchanting of objects. The Book of Enoch 8 catalogues this with a precision that feels less like mythology and more like a court record. And the Book of Jubilees adds another layer, that in the generations before the flood, the mixing did not stop with human women and watcher angels. There were corruptions at the level of the animals as well. Jubilees 5 speaks of the defilement of all flesh on the earth, not just human flesh, but the created order itself being twisted by the introduction of forbidden unions and forbidden knowledge. Which is why Genesis 6:12 says that God looked upon the earth and saw that all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. Not some flesh, all flesh. That phrase has always been larger than a simple description of human moral failure, and the Enochic tradition knows exactly why. So picture the world Noah inhabited in those final years. Not just a world of wicked people making bad choices, a world where the very categories of created being had been violated, where creatures existed that defied the boundaries God had placed between kinds, where the knowledge that was never meant to leave the heavenly realm had been handed to human hands and used to devastating effect, where giants walked with appetites that no harvest could satisfy and no army could restrain. This is the world that needed to be washed. And Noah, Genesis 6:9 is careful to tell us, was perfect in his generations. The Hebrew word there, tamim, means without blemish, without corruption. In a world where the bloodlines themselves had been contaminated, Noah's line had remained intact. That was not a small thing, that was everything. Now consider what it would have felt like to be that man, to know what you know, to see what you see every day, to watch the Nephilim moving through the landscape with their terrible size and their terrible hunger, knowing what they were, knowing where they came from, knowing that the God of heaven had already made a decision about what was coming. The book of Jasher, which is referenced in both Joshua 10:13 and 2 Samuel 1:18, expands on the period of ark construction and describes Noah preaching to the people around him, warning them, pleading with them, telling them what was coming. And the response he received was not fear, it was mockery, it was violence, it was the particular cruelty that the powerful reserve for the ones who dare to speak truth into a world that has decided truth is inconvenient. The Nephilim would have been among those who heard him, and they would not have been afraid. Why would they be? They had never known limits. They had never experienced a boundary that held. Their fathers had broken the greatest boundary in existence, the one between heaven and earth, and nothing had stopped them, at least not yet. So a man building a wooden boat in the face of an unclouded sky would have seemed to eyes like theirs like the most absurd sight in the world. But there is something the Book of Giants tells us that reframes all of this. The giants, as we noted earlier, began to dream, and not gentle dreams, violent, prophetic nightmares that their waking minds could not shake. In one account preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments, a Nephilim named Ohia dreams of a great tree being uprooted, of a garden consumed, of a power moving against everything that had been built in defiance of heaven. He wakes terrified. His brother Haya has dreamed something similar. They are shaken in a way that their physical dominance had never prepared them for, because the body can be strong and the spirit can still tremble, because you can stand 10 feet tall and still feel, in the marrow of something deeper than bone, that your time has come. This is one of the most quietly devastating things in all of this ancient literature. The giants who had terrorized the earth, who had made humanity cry out to heaven in agony, who had eaten and consumed and destroyed without remorse, they felt the end coming before it arrived, and they had no ark. There was no door open for them. There was no mercy extended to what they were, because what they were had been mercy's enemy from the moment they drew their first breath. God's grief in Genesis 6:6. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart, is often read as sorrow over human sin. And it is that. But it is also larger than that. It is the grief of a creator watching a creation that he called good become something almost unrecognizable. Watching beings made in his image reduced to prey. Watching the order. He spoke into existence in the first chapter of Genesis, methodically dismantled by rebellion, he had warned against from the beginning. Noah saw that grief reflected in the sky. He felt it in the ground beneath his feet as he drove the last peg into the last plank. The world around him was still breathing, still moving, still consuming. But it was already a world under sentence. And when the door of the ark closed, it was not just wood and pitch that sealed. It was the end of an age, the end of a world that had chosen, with full knowledge of what it was doing, to become something God could not leave standing. What came next, what the creatures outside experienced as the first drops fell, is where this story becomes something that the human imagination can barely hold. When the rain began, it did not begin the way most of us picture it. Genesis 7:11 says that on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Two things at once, from below and from above. The earth itself splitting open, water erupting from beneath the ground with a force that no human construction could have survived, and simultaneously the sky releasing what the ancient world understood as the waters above the firmament. This was not a storm. This was a reversal of creation. In Genesis 1, God had separated the waters above from the waters below, had gathered the seas, and caused dry land to appear. Now he was undoing that separation. The world was being returned, in a very deliberate sense, to the formless and void state that preceded creation's first morning. And outside the ark, in the world that was being unmade, the creatures of that corrupted age were experiencing something they had never encountered before. Limits, real ones, the kind that do not negotiate. The Nephilim had lived without meaningful limits for generations. Their size gave them power. Their hybrid nature gave them a resistance to ordinary suffering that human beings did not have. But water does not care how tall you are. Floodwater does not pause to acknowledge strength or lineage or the identity of your father. And as the waters rose, slowly at first, then with an acceleration that would have become terrifying, the giants who had made the earth tremble found themselves in a situation their entire existence had failed to prepare them for. Helplessness, complete and total helplessness in the face of something far larger than themselves. There is a rabbinic tradition, preserved in various midrashic sources, that describes the Nephilim in those final hours clinging to the outside of the ark, pounding on its walls, begging to be let in, and Noah, inside, hearing those sounds, the fists of giants against the wood, the voices of beings he had known his entire life, the sounds of a world that was ending pressed up against the thin boundary between his survival and their destruction. Some traditions suggest he wept, that his obedience did not make it painless, that faithfulness and grief are not opposites, and that a righteous man can do exactly what God commands and still carry the weight of what that obedience costs. This image, Noah on one side of the door, the Nephilim on the other, is one of the most theologically dense pictures in all of ancient literature, even if it never made it into the version of the story most of us were handed. Because what it captures is something the entire biblical narrative returns to again and again: the door that closes, the moment of grace that passes, the invitation that stood open and was not taken, and then was no longer available. Jesus uses this exact image in Matthew 25, in the parable of the 10 virgins. The door closes, and those outside say, "Lord, Lord, open to us," and the answer is, "I do not know you." The ark is not just a boat, it is a theological structure, a figure of what it means to be inside or outside of the mercy of God when judgment arrives. Peter understood this. In 1 Peter 3:20, he connects the ark directly to salvation, describing those who formerly were disobedient when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. The long-suffering of God, that phrase is doing enormous work in that verse. It means God waited. It means the door was open for a long time. It means the invitation to enter was extended across years, maybe decades of ark construction, of warning, of the kind of patience that only a God who does not want anyone to perish could sustain in the face of the violence and mockery that surrounded Noah's work. And still, the door closed. For the Nephilim, there was never a realistic path to that door. Their nature was the problem, not just their choices. They had not simply sinned. They were sin made flesh in a particular way. the embodied consequence of a rebellion that began before they were born. And yet the Book of Enoch does not treat them as simple villains deserving of simple ends. There is a pathos to the Book of Giants that is hard to ignore. These beings who dreamed terrible dreams, who sent messengers to Enoch seeking interpretation, who felt the sentence coming and had no framework to understand what it meant. They were, in a sense, the most tragic figures in the pre-flood world, not because they were innocent, they were not, but because they were what they were before they ever had the chance to choose otherwise. This is the kind of complexity that surface-level readings of Scripture consistently flatten. The ancient texts understood that the world before the flood was not a simple morality tale about bad people making bad choices. It was a cosmic drama, a war between orders of being, a conflict that had its roots in heaven and its consequences on earth, and that implicated dimensions of reality that human language struggles to contain. As the waters rose above the mountains, Genesis 7:20 tells us 15 cubits above the highest peaks, there was nothing left of the world that had been. Every living thing that was not inside the ark was gone. The Nephilim, with all their power and all their terror, were gone. The corrupted animals, the sorcerers, the men and women who had chosen the world as it was over the warning that God had offered. Gone. And the spirits of the giants, freed from their destroyed bodies, entered the long wandering that Enoch 15 described. Not gone, changed, displaced from flesh but not from existence, still present in the world, just invisible now, pressing against the living from the other side of a boundary they could no longer cross with a body. Noah floated above it all. Above the submerged mountains, above the drowned cities, above the graves of a civilization that had made itself into something creation could not sustain. He was not triumphant. There is no portrait of him celebrating on the deck. He was a man in the hands of God, carried over the ruins of everything he had ever known, toward a shore he had not yet seen. And beneath the hull of that ark, in the silent water, the old world waited for the judgment that was still, even then, not fully finished. The flood ended the physical age of the Nephilim, but it did not end what they had set in motion. What survived the flood, not in the ark, but in the unseen world, would shape the spiritual landscape of every generation that came after Noah. Every generation, including ours. There is a question that the flood raises that most people never think to ask, and it is not about what was destroyed. It is about what came after. If the flood was supposed to cleanse the earth, to give humanity a fresh beginning untainted by the corruption of the Watcher Age, then why do giants appear again in the biblical record after the flood? Why does Numbers 13:33 record the Israelite spies returning from Canaan with this report? We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. How? How are there Nephilim on the other side of a global flood that was supposed to have ended them? This is one of the most quietly destabilizing questions in the entire Old Testament, and the answers that have been offered across centuries of scholarship range from unconvincing to genuinely startling. Some suggest that the term Nephilim in Numbers 13 is being used loosely, metaphorically, to describe unusually large and powerful enemies. Others point to Genesis 6:4, which says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. That small phrase, also afterward, has carried enormous theological weight in certain traditions, suggesting that the conditions that produced the Nephilim before the flood were somehow replicated after it. The Book of Enoch itself does not fully resolve this question, but the tradition it belongs to offers a framework that makes sense of what the biblical text leaves unexplained. If the disembodied spirits of the pre-flood Nephilim continued to wander the earth after the flood, as Enoch 15 clearly states they would, then the influence of that first corruption did not die with the bodies that carried it. It persisted. It pressed. It looked for every opening it could find in the post-flood world to reintroduce what the waters had washed away. The Book of Jubilees 10 describes this directly. It records that after the flood, the spirits of the Nephilim began afflicting the descendants of Noah, leading them into sin, into error, into the kind of spiritual destruction that mirrors what the pre-flood world had experienced physically. Noah prays. He asks God to bind them, to remove them entirely. And God's response is striking. He agrees to bind the majority of them, but allows 1/10 to remain under the authority of a figure called Mastema to test and to accuse humanity. 1/10, still loose, still active, still pressing against the living world. That detail alone reframes the entire post-flood biblical narrative. The giants who appear in Canaan, in the land God promised to Abraham's descendants, were not random anomalies. They were not footnotes. They were the visible, physical expression of a spiritual war that had been running continuously since before the flood. When God commanded Israel to drive out the inhabitants of Canaan, when he gave instructions in Deuteronomy 7 that seemed to modern readers almost shockingly absolute, he was not simply dealing with political enemies or competing religions. He was ordering the removal of something that carried within it the remnant contamination of the pre-flood world. The giants of Canaan, Og of Bashan, whom Deuteronomy 3:11 tells us, had a bed that was 9 cubits long. The Anakim, the Rephaim. These were not simply tall men. They were the continuation of a problem that the flood had addressed but not permanently solved. And David understood something about this that we rarely frame correctly. When the young shepherd boy stood before Goliath in the valley of Elah, he was not merely facing a large enemy soldier. The text of 1 Samuel 17 calls Goliath a man of Gath. But the traditions surrounding the Philistine giants of that era connect them directly to the Rephaim lineage, to the bloodline that stretched back through Canaan all the way to the pre-flood world. David's 5 smooth stones were not just military preparation. In some readings of this story, they were a continuation of the same spiritual confrontation that God had been waging since before the rains fell on Noah's Ark. 5 stones, because, as some ancient commentators noted, Goliath had 4 brothers. David was prepared for all of them. The battle in that valley was older than either of them knew. This is what the Book of Enoch helps us see, that a surface reading of Scripture cannot show us on its own. The Bible is not a collection of disconnected stories. It is a single narrative about a single war, a war that began in heaven, that came to earth through the rebellion of the Watchers, that produced a physical corruption the flood was required to address, and that continued in spiritual form through every generation of biblical history. The prophets knew it. Daniel's visions in Daniel 10 describe angelic princes, spiritual powers assigned to nations, contending with the messengers of God in the heavenly places. Paul's language in Colossians 2:15, that Christ disarmed principalities and powers on the cross, is not decorative language. It is a war bulletin, a report from a battlefield that has been active since before human civilization had a name. What Jesus was doing in his earthly ministry begins to look very different when you hold all of this together. The casting out of demons recorded throughout the Gospels was not incidental to his mission. It was a direct engagement with the spiritual aftermath of what the Watchers had set in motion. In Luke 10:18, Jesus says to his disciples returning from their mission, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." He is not speaking only about a future event. He is speaking about a reality that his very presence on earth was accelerating. The dismantling of the spiritual empire that had been constructed on the ruins of the pre-flood world. Every unclean spirit he drove out was one more displaced Nephilim spirit losing its foothold in the living world. Every healing was a restoration of the order the Watchers had violated. Every moment of his ministry was, at a level most sermons never reach, a continuation of what the flood had begun. Noah could not have known all of this as he floated on the water. He could not have seen the full arc of what his survival was part of, but he had seen enough. He had lived in that world. He had watched the Nephilim move through it. He had heard the sounds outside the ark as the waters rose. And when the dove finally returned with the olive branch, that small, quiet, almost tender sign of new land, recorded in Genesis 8:11, it was arriving into the hands of a man who understood, more deeply than most, what it had cost the world to make room for something new to grow. The war was not over. It never fully was, not yet. But a chapter had closed, and in the silence after the flood, with the ark resting on the mountains of Ararat and the sun returning to a washed and quiet earth, something had been preserved that the darkness had spent generations trying to destroy. The image of God in human flesh, the line through which all the promises would eventually come, and no giant, no watcher, no disembodied spirit wandering the face of the deep had been able to stop it. What Noah witnessed before that door closed was not just the end of a world. It was proof that God's patience is real, His judgment is certain, and His mercy, for those who receive it, is the most powerful force in existence. The creatures outside the ark had every warning. The line between inside and outside was not drawn by accident. It was drawn by choice. And that truth does not belong only to Noah's generation. It belongs to ours. If this journey through the world before the flood has stirred something in you, if you felt somewhere in these truths an answer to a question you have been carrying for years, then you owe it to yourself to go deeper. Our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide on the forbidden Book of Enoch will take you further than any video can. It is richly illustrated, carefully researched, and written for people who refuse to stay on the surface of their faith. The watchers, the giants, the hidden architecture of the world God washed away, it is all there, waiting for you. Find it in the pinned comment below. Do not let it pass. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching this until the end. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment telling me what moved you most, like this video, and keep watching. The next ones are already on your screen.